Hi, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm Sasha Mackler, and I lead the energy program here at the BPC, and we're really excited to have you all join us today to focus on this really important topic of how do we transition the natural gas industry into the future, into a climate-constrained future. And we're really happy to have our first in-person energy event in over 2 years. So we'll be doing this in sort of a hybrid fashion, where we'll have all of our speakers here on stage today. We have a small group in the audience, and then of course we have all of you who are joining us online. And so we'll be taking questions from the audience as, here in the room, as well as for those of you who are watching virtually. And so we'll be moving to that here in a moment. But before we turn to the discussion, I'll say a little bit about the format today. I'm joined here with me Congressman Scott Peters, and then we'll have a panel of three speakers that'll be moderated by my colleague, Zan Fishman, and he'll introduce that panel when the Congressman and I finish up in about 20 minutes. As we think about the natural gas system, we are really faced with two realities. We have the long-term goals of the energy transition and climate change, and then of course the stark realities of today with what we see as the geopolitics around energy security. And how we combine those priorities is really an urgent question and something we'll unpack a little bit today. And while we move into the discussion, I'll turn over to the Congressman. He represents the 52nd District of California.
The only 52nd district.
The only 52nd District. He's a real bipartisan partner, very practical minded in his views on the environment and energy, and we're really thrilled to have you here with us today, Congressman.
Thank you, Sasha. Thanks for having me. And it's great to be in person. I love this, and thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center in particular for giving us great stuff to work on. We love the ideas we get from here. We love partnering up with people from both parties just because those solutions are the ones that are most sustainable and dependable. I have some prepared stuff. I'm going to refer to this and looking forward to a conversation, but I don't want to miss anything. So let me just say a few things that we've thought about ahead of time. The war in Ukraine, I think as you implied, has exposed the interconnections between energy security, environment, and the economy. We have to do everything we can to alleviate energy price shocks and support the people of Ukraine against Russian aggression. And we'll need a combination in the short term of liquefied natural gas and oil, and a swift transition to a more diverse energy economy over the long run. And as we transition to a clean energy economy, we should be really thinking about what energy security means. The Congressional Budget Office defines it as the ability of households, businesses, and governments to accommodate disruptions in supply and energy markets. So we're certainly being tested. The increase in gas prices across the United States clearly reflects a reality that this nation lacks energy security. A single actor, in this case Russia, can cause us significant economic pain because of our dependence on oil. And while I'm sympathetic to the need for more U.S. oil and gas production in the short run, I think that's inevitable and I think it's a reality. The long-term solution remains diversification, more electric vehicles, more hydrogen vehicles, more biofuels. So today we're talking about natural gas. Technological advancements related to gas extraction, production, and combustion have led to significant increases in domestic production and in LNG imports. And as a Democrat from San Diego, we're not an extracting economy. I've really tried to learn more about it. I've visited personally Midland and Odessa, Texas. Actually, tomorrow I'm talking to their chambers of commerce. And I've also just recently visited Lubbock, Texas, where I talked to folks at Texas Tech about the production. They have a wonderful petroleum engineering department with a sort of a lab out there that you can go visit. And I learned a lot from them, but we'll continue. I've introduced a methane bill, which I talk a little bit more about in a second. But I'm really trying to figure out ways in a bipartisan way, obviously, to address this diversification and need for energy security. I have learned a lot about fracking and a better understanding of how the industry is not just an economic feature of the state of Texas, for instance, which is the one I visited, but it's a feature of their culture. And so the notion that we're just going to break away from that, I think is the difficulty of that. I think is somewhat misunderstood in places like California. My Republican colleagues on the Energy and Commerce Committee never miss a chance to point out that due to the natural gas revolution, our country has not only experienced a historic level of energy supply and via that some security, but we've also cut our CO2 emissions from energy production. And that's true. I think we should be happy about that. But those opportunities will be lost unless we address the major problem of fugitive methane emissions, which is something I've been spending a lot of time on. While burning natural gas can lower carbon dioxide emissions by as much as 40 to 50% versus burning coal, almost all that benefit is wiped out if fugitive methane leaks persist at what many estimates put at around 2.5%. Last year, I co-led the resolution to reinstate the Obama-era methane regulations. President Biden signed this resolution over the summer, and EPA is currently working on a new round of regulations. I commend President Biden and the industry for their focus on reducing methane pollution. However, despite our shared goal of reducing methane emissions, I do think we're snagged up on technology-based standards as we learn more about the ability to actually monitor methane, and I think we can move to more of a performance-based standard. I hope we will do that. That's been the focus of my work. In that spirit, I introduced the Methane Act. This bill would provide a durable foundation for EPA to use performance-based standards and robust emissions measurement, reporting, and verification requirements to achieve ambitious methane emissions reductions, establish U.S. leadership internationally, and provide business with regulatory certainty and flexibility to innovate. That approach allows the regulated entities to invest in methane abatement that offer the greatest emission potential at the least cost. And my bill will prove, too, that the United States produces the cleanest LNG in the world. That gives us an economic advantage when importers like South Korea, Japan, and the European Union demand verifiably clean gas. It will also attract investment since investors are increasingly demanding climate-smart portfolios. In the absence of that standard for performance, I've encouraged EPA and companies, I could talk more about my conversation with the EPA administrator if you like, to increase transparency and better identify leaks. And we've made significant advances, and I think that there's a lot of promise ahead in working on getting this right. Natural gas also does release carbon dioxide when it's burned. Eventually, we're going to have to transition to a net zero greenhouse gas economy. For some sectors like long-distance transportation, agriculture, heavy industry, it will be very difficult to achieve zero emissions. And for that reason, I think that we can help close the gap by investing in carbon capture and carbon removal technologies. Last Congress, I introduced the Use It Act with my Republican friend from West Virginia, California and West Virginia, partnering together on energy. That's pretty good, I think. Dave McKinley. The bill that we introduced and actually passed as part of the year-end spending plan, the Use It Act, will invest in carbon capture, direct air capture, and the development of pipelines for CO2. And that bill is being implemented now. Right now, I'm working to strengthen the 45Q tax credit, develop new legislation to help deploy carbon dioxide removal technologies. And climate researchers show that we need to remove about 5 to 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every year by 2050 to limit global temperature change to acceptable levels. To date, we're at 10,000 tons, so we are way behind. The technology remains expensive, and there aren't reliable demand signals being sent to industry and investors. So it's the right time for the federal government to step in and provide early support for the development of this critical technology. The oil and gas industry is uniquely positioned to be leaders in carbon dioxide removal. The U.S. has favorable geology for large-scale storage, and I want the U.S. to lead the world in carbon capture and carbon removal technological development. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. Look forward to a conversation about anything from policy to Pelosi. And again, thanks for having me, and I hope we can do some good work together.
That's great, thanks. Well, you can see why we're thrilled to have you here with us today. You're really at the forefront on a lot of the issues as they relate to natural gas and climate and geopolitics. So thanks again for your leadership on those issues. You raised a few components of sort of the use of natural gas from the production side all the way through to the utilization. one of the things that is, I think, really important that we'll talk about in the next panel is the infrastructure system that we have in place around the country. And one of the companies in your district, Southern California Gas, has been looking at how they can leverage the natural gas distribution system for lower carbon fuels. I was just wondering if you have any reflections on the potential there and what's happening in Southern California and how that could be kind of brought forward across the country.
I'm really excited about that. I love that the industry it sees a case for improvement or for innovation. And I think that's really great. And SoCal Gas has done a real, and I can't remember the name of the link. It's
the Angelus Link.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is an example of a company seeing a few steps ahead and trying to do something that's innovative and constructive. I think it's really it's exactly what we need. We have this. The politics around this can be pretty ridiculous because there's sort of this notion that tomorrow we're going to ban natural gas and oil, right? It scares the hell out of Texas, I can tell you, because that's what they hear, right? But it's also tremendously impractical. I mean, the idea of repiping the entire country, it's pretty unrealistic. It's certainly unrealistic in the short term. So the things we need to be focusing now on improving the systems we have in place as we think about what the new systems will be. So SoCal Gas is doing this with respect to the Angelus Link. But that's why I focus on methane. We're going to be using LNG for the foreseeable future for some decades. Let's make sure it's clean. Let's do what we can do to make gasoline burn cleaner. I think all those things are to the good. And this is an example of industry stepping up, which is great.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, one of the things, just to build on what you said about LNG that we've been thinking about here at BPC is the possibility for, some political progress here in the near term, maybe driven by what we've seen in with respect to the energy markets and the invasion of Ukraine.
Right.
And what we've been wondering about, and I'd love your thoughts on this, is there an opportunity here to maybe couple an expanded use of gas globally through LNG with a more ambitious push domestically to deploy clean energy to sort of free up our gas for export, maybe through the renewable energy tax credits or those things with an LNG push? And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the political possibilities of something like that.
I think that's what's going to have to happen. And I will say on LNG, again, I mean, the bargain I would like to make with the industry is help us clean up methane. I got a phone. We got a phone call in my office. My scheduler comes in the middle of the pandemic. She says, "You got an invitation to go to Houston to speak to an energy group in person," and she's very dismissive, right? And at some place called the Petroleum Club. You don't want to go, do you? I said, "Sign me up." Sign me up because I'm trying to make the case that you probably know that at one point a contract from Brownsville for, I think, 20 years and $7 billion was canceled by France because they thought the gas was too dirty. So now they're starting to see a business case for cleaning it up. It's hard for me to make the case that you're a bridge fuel if we're leaking methane all over the place. And what I'm trying to do is engage the industry in telling me, how do we get that number way down? And I think they've been pretty receptive. I really have to say, I really got a schooling in both senses when I went to Texas Tech, because there's a degree called petroleum engineering, and I realize that it takes a long time to learn it, and it's really complicated. And I don't think I have the control mechanism right, but we got to get that right. That's the bargain I would like to make for any use of natural gas, and I think it's good for the industry. It's good for the planet. But I think that's what it's going to have to be. And then there's a lot of exciting things in development to provide energy in the longer term. From, biofuels is going to take off really soon. I spoke to a company called Veridos in my district that's doing research in algae, and and of course I'm the co-chair of the Bipartisan Congressional Algae Caucus, which you should know if you're looking for a pond scum politician. But the exciting thing is that they had this theoretical idea of developing oil from algae, and it was going along so the curve was very slow, and then all of a sudden it's jumped up, and they've reached a level where they can create the biomass and the protein or the oil in it that's going to be able to allow them to do this at scale, and it's pretty exciting. It's that you could do a drop-in fuel for airplanes or for cars today. I mean, that's a little bit longer term. It's not that far away, and all the renewables. We passed the Power On Act that I drafted as part of the bipartisan infrastructure bill to provide interstate transmission, to move renewables from where they're created in places like New Mexico to where they're needed in places like Detroit. I mean, there's a lot of stuff we're going to be doing over the long term to make these other alternative energy sources a better part of the mix, which is good for not just the planet, but it's good for reliability and I think for prices it will be over time.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Well, in a few minutes, we are going to try to be folding in some of the questions from the room or from those of you who are watching online, so please get those ready. Maybe just to shift a bit towards, what you were saying on the use side, and I know you've, in California, you're really at the forefront of the clean tech economy and those the folks who are bringing forward kind of the next generation of energy technologies. And I know you've been a big advocate of hydrogen and of natural gas. Can you say a little bit more about kind of what you see happening there? What's the possibility for the not just the generation of those fuels, but how we can fold them into our economy and use them?
Well, just on hydrogen, I think I've gotten to become more and more of a believer in hydrogen as a long-term solution. We're very excited about electric vehicles. I have one. I like my electric vehicle. We're talking about 2035 zero-emission vehicles, which in California, which right now would mean electric vehicles, and other companies committing to that too. But you got to get some pretty nasty stuff out of the ground to be able to do this over time. And I think hydrogen is probably going to be a better alternative, particularly for heavy-duty stuff. And also, I think alternative fuels is a really important thing. And natural gas is part of the economy. Like I said, it's already it's literally into our homes, from the ground to our homes. And so I just think it's silly to think we're not going to work with that and take advantage of the benefit over coal. So I think that it's also the export of it is probably to our economic advantage. I know I'll tell you a story. I was at again about my methane ask. I was in Qatar, and we went to Qatar as part of a trip with Senator Coons, mostly to thank them for the cooperation they'd given us in getting people out of Afghanistan. They've been superheroes as allies. But there was a bunch of senators and a couple of congressmen at the end. And as a House member, I was thinking, what are they going to ask about the environment? So I know Qatar and the United States are the two biggest exporters of LNG. So the emir is there, and I said, okay, what am I going to ask the emir? I asked the emir, I said, what's your plan to cut fugitive methane emissions? And this was the first question he wasn't able to answer.
Is that right?
And so he turned to his colleague and sort of barked at him in native language, and it was just after the COP in Scotland, where he had come back and said, people are really concerned about this climate change. Well, I got the emir to understand a question about methane because it came back to him, and his deputy came running out after me, and so the Qatar's going to pay attention to methane now. So again, I'm on this beat this drum about methane. I just think it's the low-hanging fruit in climate action today, and we really need help with the industry to make sure we get it right.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I know you've been a real thought leader and political leader on this whole competitiveness, challenge with respect to what our products are here in the U.S. and how they are measured from a climate perspective versus our trading partners. And I don't know if you want to say a little bit about the border carbon work that you've been working on, which I think is really important.
Right. So I'm enough of a economist. I was a professional economist for about a year and a half, so out of college.
That makes you qualified.
But I love the idea of a price on carbon to incentivize. I think about how you incentivize the industry to make investments. That's clearly the most efficient way to do it. And I was working with Chris Coons on trying to get some bipartisan support for that. It was just, we hear that there's Republicans who are interested in this. It's just a little hard to get them to come out from behind the curtain. But the other thing that's going to come up that's related to it is that, if Europe is at $70, roughly England's at $70, Canada wants to go well over $100 price on carbon, they're not just going to let us sit around and not do anything. So I would like to find a way to reward the companies in the United States that have done the right thing but also understand that we need an incentive for the country to do the right thing. And that's going to happen in trade. I mean, this is just not going to be, trade's not going to happen without some adjustment. So Chris Coons and I, Senator Coons and I did a bill that does a border carbon adjustment. And a lot of it is figuring out the accounting. It's very much directed toward getting the government to go back and figure out how it would work. But it's a phenomenon we're going to have to deal with. And I think will provide a further incentive to do the right thing. I mean, California's done really well with combination of the low carbon fuel standard and the cap and trade. You know, these things don't have to take that form, but I think that it's helped us really innovate. And I think, you know, we in the United States, we want to own that innovation, and I think part of it is getting the incentives right for private industry.
Yeah, well, we certainly share that view here at BPC. It's really important work that you've been doing. Why don't we shift now to some of the questions from the audience? I'm going to look to folks in the room here. Any questions here or from online?
We do have one from Brian Dobbs with National Journal. Do you sense the U.S. and Europeans are serious about designing new LNG infrastructure to accommodate hydrogen in the near future? Is it smart policy to plan for that transition to hydrogen?
You know, it's always interesting to characterize whether a country is serious. I think serious people are talking seriously about it, and then we have to figure out if it translates into policy. I think it's likely that people really want to do that, and I think we're headed that direction pretty clearly.
Certainly with those new motivations, maybe they're even thinking more seriously about it.
Right.
We have another one from online. Tom D. Christopher from S&P Global Commodity Insights asks, some progressives oppose deploying federal funding to support blue hydrogen. What is your sense of support for blue hydrogen in Congress?
I mean, I just try to be driven by the numbers. You know, you look at the IPCC, I mean, initially there was concern about carbon capture. I think finally people have come around on that. We don't get our numbers without pulling some stuff out of the atmosphere. On blue hydrogen, you know, we have to think about what gets us to, you know, 1.5 degrees. And I think you can't cross these things off the list. I hope we get fusion. That would be great. But in the interim, I think our response to nuclear has been overly political in many ways. I can't believe what Germany did. And in California, frankly, I'm not sure I would build new nuclear plants of this type today. But if you have useful life in them, it's hard for me to understand why we don't, you know, we don't take advantage of that. It's a huge part of our clean mix. And I think, you know, one of the strategies I would like to pursue that there's also some consternation about on the left among some people, not among everybody, is next generation nuclear. Can we reprocess some of the fuel, or can we continue to process some of the fuel that's lying next to San Onofre in a way that's constructive and productive? Can we build new kind of the small modular units that are much more, much safer and much more economically nimble? And I think, you know, we have to look at everything. So I think blue hydrogen is something we've got to run down as part of the answer, and I hope we will.
That's great. Do we have more questions from the audience?
We do. Margaret Spiegelman has asked Representative Peters, could you please speak about where things stand with the Fair Transition and Competition Act? Are you considering different designs for border adjustment measure? And what would those look like, please?
I think Senator Coons we've almost characterized it as an invitation for discussion, because if you look at the bill itself, a lot of it is trying to figure out what would be the accounting mechanisms and the ways we would adjust it, because it's super complicated. It's more complicated if you don't have a price on carbon.
Right.
Or that we hope maybe that provides some incentive for the country to think about it. So it's at a very early stage, and a lot of I think we've engaged a lot of academics and industry folks around town in helping us think about it. But you know, it's certainly we would consider changes. We want to get it right. I think it's really an invitation to start a conversation about how to do this right.
Well, I think it's a common theme we're hearing is sort of, getting the math right is really
Yeah,
important on
right.
all of this, from the carbon accounting on the upstream
Right.
leakage to the carbon accounting for the international trade aspects, to the carbon accounting when it comes to blue hydrogen versus green hydrogen. Those are really the hard parts, and then of course bringing folks together
Right.
to get the
Right.
to get the right policies in place. We just have a couple minutes left. We can turn to. We have one more question. Oh, from here. Sorry.
Congressman Peters, where does energy efficiency fit in your vision of the decarbonizing U.S. economy?
I guess they say the best energy is the energy you don't use. The cleanest energy is the energy you don't. I think it's really important. I think we have to look ourselves in the mirror and ask what we're incentivizing. I don't think we do a very good job of incentivizing clean energy or energy efficiency. And it's interesting. The way we've reacted to higher gas taxes is pretty telling about where the politics are that are a challenge for climate activism and conservation. I like the idea that an F-150 could be electric, but people still want these huge cars to drive their kids to soccer practice. Four-wheel drive vehicles to drive around La Jolla. It doesn't make any sense to me. But so I think we have to figure out a way to incentivize energy efficiency from every actor in the economy, from the largest corporation to the household. And I think we have a little work to do on that.
Thanks, Congressman. We have one more question we want to fit in here before we let you go.
You mentioned earlier that you'd had a conversation with the EPA administrator about performance standards for LNG facilities. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, so they put out a rule. We had a conversation with him as part of the Sustainable Environment Caucus, Energy and Environment Caucus. I think he's not as confident as my impression that the ability to monitor methane in terms of presence and quantity is sufficient that we can go to a performance standard yet. So I think that the way that the rule is headed is more technology mandates, even for existing facilities. New sources, it's easier because you just require them, you use this pump, use this compressor, that's easier. But it's hard to think about retrofitting it. So he's in the middle of sifting through comments, but he did acknowledge that there's an interest in performance standards that would be more efficient and potentially more effective, and I'm going to continue to work with him. He's been very responsive to us, and we want to be supportive of his effort.
Well, that's great. Thank you. And thank you for your time today and your leadership on these issues. We really appreciate your willingness to drop by and share some of your thoughts with us as part of this discussion.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's fun for us to work on these problems because it's such an exciting area. It's such a fundamental area for the economy. I really fought to get on the energy subcommittee, so I would love to continue to work with you and with you all on solutions that would get us real energy security and real climate action. I think there's a lot of opportunity, and that's why I fly from a really nice place to a really cold place too many times.
Well, we really appreciate it. Thank
Thanks
you.
so much, Sasha.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, John. So you're free to go now, and I will help us transition to the next panel. And I'll do that really quickly by introducing Zan Fishman, my colleague, who's the Director of Energy Policy and Carbon Management here at BPC. And I'll just say that he's been with us for about a year, and before joining us at BPC, he was Chief of Staff for Congressman John Delaney. And I'll let him come on up, and he will introduce the next panel. Thank you.
Actual in-person events. All right, please come on up. Well, that was an absolutely terrific start to this event. Congressman Peters is just great on so many energy topics. And now we have an amazing panel. So I'm going to introduce them, and then I will ask them some questions. After that, we'll open up to questions from the audience that we have here in person, and also from the the audience virtually. So if you are watching from a distance and you want to ask a question of the panel here, you can use the live chat on YouTube, or if you're on Twitter, you can use the hashtag BPC Live. So without further ado, our panel, we've got in the middle, Miriam Brown is president of Southern California Gas Company, a Sempra-regulated California utility. Miriam knows her way around Washington, D.C. Before becoming president of SoCalGas, she served as vice president of federal government affairs for Sempra and as the senior energy and environmental counsel for the office of the Speaker of the House of Representatives and the energy chief counsel for the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. And she was also policy counsel for the U.S. Senate's Republican Policy Committee. Before that, she was a manager of public policy and strategic planning for ConocoPhillips. Next, on the end over there, we've got Joe Heiser. He's the principal and executive vice president of the Energy Futures Initiative. Joe co-founded EFI with former Secretary of Energy Moniz and Melanie Kennardine. Joe is the lead executive on key EFI research projects, such as the Department of Energy's budget priorities and federal tax incentives for energy innovation. Joe served as the chief financial officer and senior advisor to Secretary of Energy Moniz. And prior to joining the DOE, Heiser was a senior member of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Energy Initiative and served at the White House Office of Management and Budget. The third member of our panel is Ralph Cavanna. He's the energy co-director for the Climate and Clean Energy Program at NRDC, the National Resources Defense Council. Ralph joined NRDC in 1979 and has focused on removing barriers to cost-effective energy efficiency. He has been at the center of every major federal energy policy moment since then, and maybe even before. He has also served on the Secretary of Energy's advisory board and has taught energy law and policy at Harvard Law School, Stanford Law School, the UC Berkeley Law School, and the University of Idaho. And near and dear to us, he is also a board member here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. So, let's get to some questions. We're going to start off talking about the distribution system. Then we're going to move on to the fuels themselves and a few other related topics. And I've got a question to start off with, but if you have any opening thoughts to chime in with along with this first question, or any reaction to some of the things that Congressman Peters said, please feel free to jump in with your first answer here. So we'll start with Miriam. SoCalGas recently announced a goal to get to net zero by 2045 across scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. You released a clean fuel strategy to achieve that goal and announced the Angelus Link project concept. So, with that in mind, what is the role of the natural gas distribution infrastructure in a decarbonized world? Because the goal is we got to get to net zero, but we have to do it in a way that keeps energy reliable and affordable.
Right.
And how does your plan get us there?
Decarbonized gases are essential for us to get to net zero. Now, it's important to remember that net zero does not mean no natural gas. Net zero means increasing our decarbonized gases, decreasing traditional natural gas, and using carbon management technologies, as the congressman was talking about earlier in his discussion. So we did look very deeply at this and published analytics last fall about how California might best achieve its economy-wide net zero goals. And the bottom line takeaway from that work was that clean fuels like hydrogen and renewable natural gas, combined with electrification and fuel cells and carbon management, provide the most affordable, most resilient, most technologically proven, most equitable pathway to get to net zero. And the reason for this is that electrification and clean fuels really are perfect partners. When you combine the strengths of renewable electricity from solar and wind with the strengths of clean fuels like hydrogen and renewable natural gas, that is our fastest way to get to net zero. So as we at SoCalGas look out to 2045 and 2050, We know that the mix of our fuels will be different from what it is today, and we also know that the value of the infrastructure remains the same, and in my mind, it actually increases. But we also know that that infrastructure gets used in different ways, more to support electric generation, more to support heavy-duty trucking and industrial end uses.
Thanks. Just quick follow-up. When we're thinking about investments, like what is the scale of the investment needed to get from here to there?
I think I'd put focus on Angelus Link that was referenced earlier in our discussion. So, in January, if you had looked at a world map of all of the major green hydrogen initiatives around the globe, you would see that every continent, except for Africa and North America, had a major green hydrogen infrastructure project on their drawing board. And the reason for that momentum and that growth around green hydrogen really is because hydrogen is the one gaseous fuel that when it combusts, it emits no carbon. So while there are challenges with hydrogen, its many applications make it worthwhile. And that dynamic changed in February when SoCalGas announced Angelus Link. So what Angelus Link is a proposal to build the country's largest green hydrogen pipeline infrastructure system, sourcing green hydrogen from renewable electricity in eastern parts of the state, where our solar resource is very rich, and bringing that pure, dedicated hydrogen stream into the LA basin. It would serve the sectors of our economy that are viewed as hard to electrify, so heavy-duty transportation, electric generation, and high heat manufacturing applications, which are very significant in Southern California. A lot of people don't know this, but the Los Angeles area is the largest manufacturing center in the country, and we have the 2 largest ports in the country. We view it as creating a cornerstone for the hydrogen economy in California, in particular Southern California, and really significantly advancing the state's greenhouse gas goals as well as environmental pollution goals. So as an example, in one scenario, we contemplate that it could convert 4 of what are currently natural gas power plants that LADWP, our large municipal electric utility that they have in the LA basin, convert those to sourcing hydrogen as their fuel source, as well as reduce, if the balance of that hydrogen was used for heavy-duty trucking, remove 3 million gallons of diesel off the road a day. That's 1 billion gallons a year. And so the GHG reductions are very significant, and the NOx reductions are so very significant. I can think of no other large infrastructure project that actually would make that kind of significant difference. And to the point of the beginning of our conversation about reaching net zero, that same scenario has us displacing approximately 25% of the natural gas in our entire system, and as the largest gas utility in the country, that's a significant amount of natural gas.
Thank you. Ralph, I'm going to turn to you, both for just opening thoughts and specifically, what is the role of our gas distribution infrastructure in a decarbonized world?
Well, first, an overarching comment. It is almost exactly 20 years since what became the Bipartisan Policy Center launched in Washington, D.C. At a time of international turmoil, massive pressure on fossil fuel markets. It's not an altogether unfamiliar scenario. And in the ensuing 20 years of constructive engagement on finding clean energy and climate solutions, one continuing theme, which I annoyingly insist on continually returning to, is the overriding importance of energy efficiency as we move to a decarbonized economy and a decarbonized world. Every question asked about how much will it cost, how hard will it be, vitally depends on how energy efficient the systems and the end uses are as we move forward. And one of the most important findings of the Bipartisan Policy Center in one of its early reports, looking at progress in energy efficiency over 40 years, and it's a very positive story, as Miriam and Joe know, was that in the 40 years since in the early 1970s, the first great oil shocks, the most important single resource, it wasn't perhaps all that surprising that the most important single resource was energy efficiency in terms of its contributions to the US economy. But it might surprise you all to learn, and this was the BPC finding, and it's held up ever since, that the energy efficiency contribution to meeting the needs of a growing economy in the US exceeded that of every other energy resource combined. So we can't have a discussion about decarbonization without focusing on that. It's important for the natural gas sector, it's important for electricity, industry, everything. Now I want to say a word about the Angelus Link. I think I agreed with what Miriam said about it, but she's not in a position, I am in a position given my vast historic scope and sweep. It's the only person in this room who's had the same job since 1979. This is a potentially transformative proposal. Understand, for everyone who's skeptical about whether a natural gas company can be a clean energy partner, look at what's on the table here. It's a dedicated network to deliver zero carbon green hydrogen to hard to electrify sectors throughout Southern California. Probably need to add a Diego to the Angeles to get Congressman Peters to remember what it's called. But this is, if you're thinking about a future for gas companies, and it's built around those elements, and there are a million important questions to answer, and we're going to work with her to do that, as are a whole lot of other stakeholders in California. My hope and expectation is the California PUC will launch the inquiry that she's requested with all of us at the table. But this is a proposal appropriate both in its ambition, as she described it. This is more than 1 million tons of hydrogen a year being delivered into markets that are the hardest to electrify. But it's also appropriate in its humility, in that many of the critical details will be resolved with the full participation of the communities and the stakeholders involved. She has made that commitment. I know she will keep it. And if we can do this, it creates a vision of what the natural gas industry can do to decarbonize that really, I think, for many, will be a source of hope and inspiration. We have a ways to go in order to get there, but I'm glad we're starting. And in a way, it feels to me like today is an excellent moment to declare the importance of that beginning and to enlist all of you in helping to make it come to fruition. Thank you.
Turning to you next, Joe. Any opening thoughts, and specifically, what is the role of natural gas distribution infrastructure, and is net zero possible without decarbonized gas?
Thank you. I'll get to your question in a minute, but let me kind of do it in a broader perspective. And let me start off by saying that I guess it's been nearly 5 years ago now that I worked with former Energy Secretary Oni Moniz when we formed the Energy Futures Initiative. And our focus over the past 5 years has been on looking for policies and strategies for clean energy and decarbonization based on innovation, and innovation not only technological, but also innovation in policy and business models. And I think where I'd like to start today, given the current global situation, is talk a little bit about the global perspective and then come back to the question about infrastructure. And I think it was back in 2015 when we were all at the Department of Energy that we worked on a project for then Secretary Moniz on developing a new set of global energy security principles to move us beyond the 1970s concerns about energy security as defined as oil security. And I think what was really important in those principles was the fact that we introduced the linkage between energy security and climate change. And the Secretary at that time was very successful in getting those principles adopted by the G7 energy ministers that year. And so from our perspective, looking at it globally, we see energy security, climate change, and economic development as all key objectives, and they're interconnected, they're interrelated, and you need to make progress on all three fronts in parallel. And that's sort of what we've been working on. And in the natural gas area, last year, my colleague, Melanie Kenderdine, led an effort where we convened a series of virtual workshops looking at 8 different regions of the globe, looking at development opportunities and how they would relate to decarbonization and net zero. And what we found is that natural gas will play an important role in not only in development, but also in the transition to a net zero. And thinking about the infrastructure in the US, we have a large existing infrastructure, and I think the issue there, as Miriam described, is more one of transitioning from serving from traditional fossil fuels to clean fuels. In some of the developing countries, the challenge is a little bit different. It's developing new infrastructure that in the short term may be supporting the development of natural gas, but also will need to transition. And I think there was a recent article that was co-authored by Jason Bordoff and Megan O'Sullivan, where they referred to this issue and talked about energy infrastructures as needed to be what they call transition ready. Either that they would need to be developed with the notion that they would serve a limited time period, or they would need to be developed in such a fashion that they could transition. And I think that's really what we're talking about here today, is how do we take our existing natural gas infrastructure, and as Miriam described, as how do we deploy that in the future to support things like renewable natural gas and clean hydrogen. The last point I would just want to make is that, and again, is that getting to net zero does not mean that you get rid of natural gas, because net zero, the important term there is net. And one of the other major initiatives that we've been undertaking at EFI has been looking at the issue of carbon removal. And we see a lot of opportunities there for carbon removal, and as well as the need for carbon removal, because ultimately it's not just a matter of getting to net zero. To get to a 1.5 degree C scenario in the future, we ultimately will probably need to get to net negative emissions. And you can't get there without carbon removal technologies. And so we've been working hard on looking at strategies for development and deployment and of things like direct air capture, but also looking more broadly at other pathways for carbon removal, including biological, marine, and terrestrial approaches as well. And we see a lot of opportunities there. We see a lot of need for innovation there over the next decade. But we do see the potential there that this would be a strategy that could go along with issues like efficiency, clean fuels, and carbon removal as all contributing, making major contributions to a net zero future.
Thank you, thank you. And it's such a good point in that, you know, climate change and energy is a very multifaceted issue. It, you know, impacts businesses, individuals, families in so many different ways, and it will require many solutions working in tandem. We've already talked about efficiency, we've talked about electrification, we've talked about renewables, we've talked about renewable natural gas, we've talked about hydrogen, we've talked about carbon dioxide removal now. Keeping the big picture in mind that the goal is net zero in a way that's affordable and reliable, and eventually getting to net negative, as you said, so that we can actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere and return the atmosphere back to what we would consider normal levels of CO2. That's crucial. Miriam, back to you. Talk a little bit about federal policies. The American Gas Association just released Net Zero Emissions Opportunities for Gas Utilities report, which presents a national level approach that leverages the unique advantages of natural gas technologies in distribution infrastructure. What do you think are the federal policies that can enable this decarbonization of the natural gas network? And if you want to talk a little bit about the policy, a little bit about the politics, that might be helpful.
Sure. And before I get into that, I do want to make a comment on your point, which I think is a really good one. And I think the bottom line point is that how the energy transition takes place matters, right? Because energy has to be a lot of things. It needs to be affordable, and it needs to be reliable, and it needs to be resilient, and it needs to be clean, and it needs to be all of these things at the same time. And so this balance and pragmatism that we're all talking about is so very important. I do think that there's a really important and valuable role for federal policy to support clean fuels and their advancement. Obviously, a big one is R&D. And Ralph alluded to the kinds of questions that we need to be able to answer, like water use and secondary emissions from combustion associated with hydrogen. These are all things where working together and with the best and brightest minds, we feel very confident that there are solutions, but that support, especially from DOE on the R&D side, is really important. I think that financial support can be very important. We saw in the bipartisan infrastructure package an allocation of about $9.5 billion for hydrogen hubs, and that's very real money, not subject to appropriations. And it's been really incredible to see the momentum in the different regions in the country, in the Northeast, in the Rockies, and obviously in California, where we are at SoCalGas, organizing to be able to demonstrate the viability of a hydrogen hub. And what I would say is that was an excellent policy, and we can have even more of those, as well as tax support to support these investments that on the front end, the costs are high, but we see them going down significantly over the next several years. And then I think another policy that could be very valuable, and we saw the first of its kind in California, is a clean gas standard. California recently, their PUC adopted a renewable natural gas standard, similar to a renewable electricity standard that was adopted for electricity, and was very supportive in increasing the penetration of solar and wind. It's a similar policy at this time focused on renewable natural gas, but we could see a world where hydrogen would be included. And there are other policies. I think something, though, that's important to keep in mind, and again, it goes to Ralph's point at the outset about the Bipartisan Policy Center and what it brings to the table. What the industry really needs, and what we really need if we're going to accomplish these goals that we have, these twin goals around energy security and a clean energy transition, is an energy policy that does not have wild swings, that there is consistency. And that's really what's going to support the investment. Last week, it was reported that Jamie Dimon made a recommendation to the president that a Marshall Plan be adopted for supporting Europe in the energy context. And that's a great idea, but an important takeaway from the Marshall Plan is that it had very strong bipartisan support, right? And I think that that's what makes work like organizations at the Bipartisan Policy Center so very important. We need to be very careful as we move forward that these twin goals of energy security and the clean energy transition, that they don't get bifurcated and it doesn't become a false choice between one and the other. And in our minds, that's the idea of leveraging the strategic advantage that we have with natural gas infrastructure and natural gas resources, but then project that prosperity forward and invest in these clean fuels and the infrastructure that we're going to need in the future.
Thank you. Ralph, just over to you. What do you think are the federal policies? What's the outlook? What do we need to get from here to there?
Well, back to energy efficiency for a moment. The federal government has available to it an enormous, one of the most potent tax incentives that none of you have ever heard of. It's Section 179D of the Federal Tax Act. How are you ever going to remember that? What it is a tax incentive for new and remodeled commercial and multifamily buildings to dramatically improve on their energy efficiency compared to existing code. You basically get paid a substantial bounty if you can beat the prevailing codes by 50% or more. That's a good idea. It's never been fully activated, though, because we've lacked the regulatory guidance at the Department of Energy to make it easy for Miriam's many constituents and customers to take advantage of that tax credit. She'll be all for it. She doesn't have to pay for it, but she wants to help her customers take advantage of it. So there's some unfinished business at the Department of Energy. White House and DOE know that. They need to get it done. They need to get that regulatory guidance out so that every new commercial and remodeled and multifamily building, there are strong equity dimensions to this, can take full advantage. And then I'm hoping and expecting that the Department of Energy and all aspects of the federal government will work even harder to restore the energy efficiency progress that, sadly, over the 4 years of the previous administration was largely interrupted. There is much to do there. The federal government has standards that cover essentially all equipment using natural gas and electricity that any of you use. And it has been to our resounding benefit that those standards have been in place since Ronald Reagan signed them into law in 1987. And now we need to pick up that momentum and accelerate it. Because as I look at the international crisis, the one point I want to emphasize in closing is at comparable moments when facing all of the pain associated with rapidly increasing fossil fuel prices, and we've been there before, the fastest, cheapest, cleanest solutions all involve using less. And right now, in terms of responding to what we're facing in the volatile fossil fuel markets and looking at ways to free up more resources for use elsewhere, that is a collective enterprise in which all of us can participate. Those tax incentives, those standards are important for the new uses of energy going forward. But the ability collectively to act, as much of Japan did, by the way, over the last week in averting what otherwise would have been massive grid disruptions after a tsunami and severe weather. The ability to do that together may be, in the short term, the most important thing we all bring to this.
Thank you. Joe, over to you. You've got insight into DOE that rivals pretty much anyone. What? Yeah. Pretty much anyone. What federal policy should we be looking at?
Well, looking at the transition, particularly to clean hydrogen, there's a sort of a chicken and the egg aspect to it. And within DOE, historically, the focus has always been on more on the supply side with, hydrogen production and hydrogen technology. And I think there now needs to be much more of a focus on building the market. And one of the projects that we're currently doing at EFI is looking at market development policies for a clean hydrogen market. And I think it's a combination. Obviously, there's a significant need for technological innovation. We see in the industry right now efforts underway to increase the ability of, for example, of gas turbines to run on hydrogen. There's continuing efforts on technologies such as fuel cells and others like that. But we also see the need for, on the policy side, two things. One being making sure that we have the appropriate regulatory environment. Because again, while we know a lot about hydrogen, hydrogen's used a lot in industrial applications, but introducing hydrogen into a much broader market, we need to make sure we have the right framework in place for that. And I think the other issue is one of just the market development and creating what I would call the market pool incentives. And I think the recent enactment of the hydrogen hubs initiative in the infrastructure bill, I think it will be just a significant stepping stone in that direction. I think for those of you who have been following some of this in the energy media, you'll see that there's virtually announcements about the potential for hydrogen hubs being formed every day in virtually every single region of the country right now. And the fact of the matter is that to really develop those hubs will take an investment level that is at least one order of magnitude greater, if not several orders greater, than what currently Congress has provided in the sort of this seed funding. And so how these hubs get formed and how they get formed in a way that they can become self-sustaining and can grow, we see that as a very critical issue going forward. And I think that's one that I know in our conversations with our former colleagues at DOE that I know they're grappling with right now. We're trying to figure out how to design the framework for funding those hubs in a way that would get them launched and off and running.
Terrific. So here's just I'm going to ask two broad questions to just all of you. Maybe you can just jump in whichever one you'd like to answer. I've got God, so many questions here that I want to ask, and we're rapidly running out of time, and I do want to get to audience questions because I don't want to be completely selfish. Well, maybe I do want to be completely selfish. So two questions. One of the things that really keeps me up at night is the permitting issue. We have to build so much infrastructure, clean infrastructure, to get to net zero by 2050. And we have to protect the environment and uphold all our environmental standards. We have to do both of those things. Our current regulatory structure around permitting often requires 2, 5, 10 years for approvals for certain
15,
infrastructure.
20. You're right.
And that's scary to me. If we have to build massive amounts of infrastructure over the next 30 years, and we don't actually get any climate benefit of that infrastructure until it's built, which takes even longer than the permitting. You have to permit it and then you build it, right? If we don't build it now, if we can't speed that up, like how can we get to 2050? That's question number one. And the other question I'll ask at the same time, and you guys can pop in here, is particularly when we're thinking about this natural gas infrastructure. One of the things we have to think about are methane leaks. Congressman Peters brought that up. It's a thing that he's been really focused on. How do we solve both of those problems simultaneously at the same time? What are your thoughts on that?
Great question. I think on the methane leakage issue, that's something that's a big priority at SoCalGas, and as part of our net zero commitment to 2045, that includes our own emissions as part of our operation system. And we've already made a transition from cast iron to steel and to plastic to help mitigate the methane emissions issues. But we've also been using a lot of innovative technologies, aerial mapping, and we were the first in the gas utility industry to use tools like that to identify where leaks could be and make sure that our system is as tight as it needs to be. On the permitting issue, I think that there are a lot of different aspects to take on that, and maybe the part that I would want to focus on here is, yes, we definitely need policies to support efficiency in the permitting process. And to Joe's point about the cost of hydrogen, and so much great work has been done to bring down the cost of the production of hydrogen, we were part of a coalition called Heiser LA. And it was a consortium of a number of parties in Southern California looking to bring hydrogen from the eastern parts of the state into the LA basin. And a third of the cost associated with bringing that hydrogen to market was the pipeline infrastructure, right? And that's what Angelus Link brings to the table as far as bringing hydrogen at the price point that makes it competitive with traditional fuels. But as much as government support to ease the permitting process is important, I also think that we, the developers, have to do a little bit to help ourselves. And that is the model, the approach that we have taken on Angelus Link and that Ralph was alluding to, which is the filing that we made with the PUC earlier this year was the ability to start the process to develop the project application. And we're following a method of having all of our stakeholders at the table through the entire process, both the scoping of the project, the development of the engineering around the project, and the environmental permits. And that may sound like slower than the traditional way of citing projects, but in my mind, in the modern era, you have to go slow to go fast. You have to measure twice to cut once and make sure those stakeholders are with you, because that's one of the things that you start getting to that 15 and 20 when you don't take those steps on the front end. So, thank
you. And Ralph alluded to the environmental justice piece of this conversation earlier, and that's important for all of us and important for the speed decision. So thank you for bringing that up. Any other response?
Yeah. Just a quick. So just to follow up on Miriam, on the Angelus Link in particular, she has rightly engaged, and the application acknowledges it. The involvement of communities that want reassurance that air quality will improve where they are, not just across a vast area, that their concerns about siting will be taken seriously up front, not at the very end, I do think is going to be an excellent test of the proposition that measuring twice and cutting once in this context actually works. And our commitment is to try to do everything we can to help make that a reality. I will also note that very few energy efficiency upgrades require massive permitting, and that is yet another reason for all of you to take them seriously. But I acknowledge that, and I think much of the environmental community has figured out that the clean energy transition is going to require a lot of infrastructure. And I took sorrowful note of the fact that a major transmission addition in Southern California, which Miriam's well aware of, that Southern California Edison did in concert and coordination with tribes that own much of the rights-of-way, it still took more than 12 years to do it. We have to be able to do these projects faster. The environmental community has developed a rooting interest in transmission, which is showing up in support for example, all that the bipartisan infrastructure bill did to start to make a dent in those unnecessary delays. And I predict that if Miriam can make dedicated hydrogen pipelines carrying green hydrogen a reality, a lot of environmental groups will discover that the word pipeline has taken on a whole new meaning, and I look forward to being there when it happens.
Joe?
If I could just add, and I'll add this from being sort of the inside government perspective, that I want to compliment the BPC, I think, for their recent task force report on permitting, I think. Had a lot of good ideas. And I think that looking at it from the sort of the governmental process side, that having a sort of a common database, having coordinated schedules, and having some sort of a monitoring and reporting process can be very important. I mean, ultimately, the issue with federal and state permitting is that there's many permits, there's many different authorities, they're all narrowly focused. The decision criteria can vary greatly across them. So by at least bringing the process together, that could help a great deal. But I think it's going to take some leadership within the government, on the governmental side, to kind of move this along. And I think what would be good would be, to begin to pilot this for looking at some of the, a few major projects that have broad geographic coverage, and kind of, begin to actually see if we can make the process work.
Terrific. This is just a terrific conversation. I have so many more questions. You guys have such good answers. But I'm going to turn to the audience, and hopefully they'll ask the questions that I wanted to ask anyway. That's my hope.
I'll ask one. Thank you to the panelists. I'd love to hear thoughts following up on something Congressman Peters said about the role of biofuels potentially playing a larger role in decarbonization of the economy. I wanted to ask about biomass-based renewable natural gas, if you could weigh in a little bit more about some of the potential opportunities, potential limitations of renewable natural gas.
Thanks for that question. SoCalGas is very high on renewable natural gas in general. We were the first gas utility to set a voluntary goal of 5% of our system being renewable natural gas core system by 2022 and 20% by 2030. Renewable natural gas can find its sources from a wide range of waste. You mentioned biomass. It can also come from landfills and from dairy and from agriculture. What we have with renewable natural gas is there is a methane emissions problem from decomposing waste. And what we are doing is, instead of it being a methane emissions problem, we are capturing that methane and we are using it for its energy value. And if you're trying to get to net zero, you need net negatives like renewable natural gas if you're trying to make that math work to get to net zero. I think that sometimes there is an instinct to view renewable natural gas as a one-for-one replacement for traditional natural gas. And I just don't think that that's what its purpose is. I think at the roots of renewable natural gas, its purpose is to prevent the climate emissions from decomposing waste. As I mentioned earlier, we're very excited about the renewable natural gas standard that they have started to set in California, and we think that it's going to be very helpful in us managing those emissions. The state has some very significant goals in that space.
Go ahead, Joe.
I would just add that again, at EFI right now, we actually are also doing some work on bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and we do see that as playing an important role, as Miriam said, not just simply as a energy source, but also as an important source of net negative emissions. Of course, that assumes that one of the challenges that we see is working through the numbers, in effect, doing the carbon accounting and doing it in a way that is transparent and in a way that, that sound methodologies. I would just also say that I think when you think about it, not only for gaseous fuels, but also bioenergy products that are liquid fuels, we have the potential to create clean liquid fuels with a net negative carbon footprint.
I just want to underscore Joe's point about getting the accounting right, because our approach is more cautious, I think, than Miriam's, in part because we've seen sectors in which I want to agree with her that if methane is otherwise going to go into the atmosphere, you want to take it and use it and prevent that from happening. But you also want to avoid situations where you are unintentionally creating an economic incentive to put more methane into the system without, on a life cycle basis, helping. And in forest products in particular, we have seen that happen on a number of occasions. But if we'd like to, Joe's point is let's transparently do the accounting and determine whether we're helping or hurting. And I think on that principle, we can all concur.
Terrific. We have more questions from the audience, virtual audience?
Yes, we have a number of questions around the physical characteristics of the distribution system currently, and introducing new fuels. Are there safety implications? Are there any number of technical difficulties, end use to starting point, that need to be sorted?
So renewable natural gas we view as a drop-in fuel. So it is seamlessly incorporated into our pipeline system today. So retrofits to our system are not needed. On the subject of hydrogen, and that might be what the driver of that question is, we have a separate initiative, and there are similar initiatives throughout the country and globally to look at blending hydrogen into the existing gas infrastructure system. So this is that opportunity to leverage the existing system and continue to decarbonize the fuels. Right now, together with the other gas utilities in California, we're poised to file an application with our PUC to test blending up to 20% hydrogen in our system. We've been testing it in our own facilities already, and there's a lot of momentum around that to show that the current pipelines are going to be able to hopefully comfortably incorporate hydrogen in the system safely.
But as we look at those issues, let's not in any way minimize either the difficulty or the importance of solving that leakage problem. We've referred to it repeatedly today, but the magnitude of it, not just in the distribution system, but upstream, is part of what a fundamental question about the future and the contributions and the potential of the whole natural gas sector. And we are not making enough progress there. We need to enlist the entire system. And the challenge, and I know Miriam has taken it on, but more need to, is for everyone to show in Joe's world of transparent accounting that we are really making dramatic and measurable progress on what right now just fugitive emissions, a relatively innocent sounding term, are contributing materially to the continued global climate crisis. And I think we are all in agreement on that, and we know how much more needs to be done on it.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. I think we definitely need better measurement systems, and we need to think about modernizing our infrastructure, not only to address the issue of fugitive emissions, but also to address the issue of making them hydrogen capable. And I think you could do both of those at the same time. There may need to be a need for some financial incentives there to address some of the cost premiums or others, but I think that's a really important objective.
Terrific. Well, we are wrapping this up. We're getting to the end of our time. I wish we had 45 more minutes. This has been just a really terrific discussion. We've talked about the distribution system. We've talked about the fuels themselves. We got a little bit into market demand, maybe not as much as I would have liked. We talked about environmental justice. We talked about the whole suite of climate solutions, efficiency, carbon management, renewables, the whole, we didn't get into the colors of hydrogen, but maybe we can talk about that next time, the rainbow of hydrogen. But thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the virtual audience. It's been really great to have this actual in-person event and hybrid event, so we're able to get people in the same building, but also be accessible to those of you who weren't able to come. And I'm really looking forward to talking more about this topic, all of energy topics, how to get to net zero, and seeing you all in the future. Thank you so much.